I never thought a piece of 19th century farm equipment would become the thing that brought down an entire homeowners association board. But here we are, and honestly, they had it coming. My name is Henry Kellerman, and I bought a 2-acre property in Meadowbrook Springs, Oregon, about 3 years ago. The house was a charming craftsman-style home with exposed beams and a stone fireplace, but what really sold me on the place was the orchard. 28 apple trees, ranging from Honeycrisp to Granny Smith, spread across the back portion of my property in neat, established rows. The previous owner, an elderly man named Walter, had maintained them for decades, but was moving into assisted living. He told me the trees were his pride and joy, and when he showed me the old cider press in the barn, his eyes actually got misty. "My grandfather brought this from Pennsylvania in 1932, Walter said, running his weathered hand over the cast iron frame. "Still works perfectly." "You promise me you will use it, son." I promised. And I meant it. The first year I was so busy with renovations inside the house that I mostly ignored the orchard. I hired a local service to prune the trees and spray them, and when harvest came, I picked what I could and gave most of it away to neighbors. The cider press sat unused in the barn, gathering dust, but still magnificent in its solid, functional beauty. The second year, I got serious. I researched orchard management, learned about proper pruning techniques, and started really caring for those trees. The harvest was spectacular. I spent weekends pressing cider, and let me tell you, there is nothing quite like fresh-pressed apple cider made from fruit you grew yourself. I gave away gallons of the stuff, sold some at the local farmer's market, and even experimented with hard cider fermentation in my basement. That was when I first encountered Patricia Montgomery. Patricia was the president of the Meadowbrook Springs Homeowners Association, a position she had held for 7 consecutive years. She was 53 years old with aggressively highlighted blonde hair cut in that specific angular bob that seems to be issued along with HOA board membership. She drove a white Lexus SUV and had a habit of appearing at your door unannounced with a clipboard and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Henry, I have been meaning to talk to you about your agricultural activities," she said one Saturday morning in October, standing on my porch in a cream-colored pantsuit despite it being the weekend. "Agricultural activities," I repeated, genuinely confused. I was wearing jeans with mud on the knees and an old flannel shirt, having just come in from the orchard. "The farm stand you are operating from your property. I have received complaints." "You mean the 4 times I sold cider at the farmer's market downtown? That is not on my property, Patricia." "That is at the public market." Her smile tightened. "I am referring to the commercial agricultural operation you are running from this residence. The HOA covenants are very clear about home businesses." I invited her in, mostly because I was raised to be polite, but I was already feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach. We sat at my kitchen table, and she pulled out a thick binder of HOA rules and regulations. "Section 12, paragraph 4, she said, flipping to a tabbed page. "No homeowner shall operate a commercial enterprise from their property without prior written approval from the board. Your cider operation constitutes a commercial enterprise." I made cider from my own apples and sold maybe 30 gallons total. I probably made $200, Patricia. "That barely covers the cost of the bottles and labels. The scale is irrelevant. The activity is commercial in nature." I took a deep breath. "Fine. What do I need to do to get approval?" "You would need to submit an application, pay the $500 review fee, and appear before the board. However, I should warn you that we have never approved a commercial agricultural operation in this neighborhood. It sets a precedent we are not comfortable with. My property has had an orchard for over 40 years. That may be true, but the previous owner never commercialized it. He never sold his produce. That changes the nature of the activity. We went back and forth for another 20 minutes before she finally left. I was frustrated but figured I would just not sell the cider anymore. I could give it away, drink it myself, whatever. No big deal, but Patricia was not done with me. 2 weeks later, I got a formal letter from the HOA stating that I needed to submit a property agricultural plan for review because my orchard maintenance activities were creating excessive noise and unsightly conditions. The letter cited a specific complaint about seeing piles of rotting fruit on my property and industrial equipment operating early in the morning. The rotting fruit was a compost pile, carefully maintained in the far back corner of my property, well away from any neighbor's view. The industrial equipment was my lawn tractor, which I operated at 9 in the morning on Saturdays. Hardly an unreasonable time. I called the HOA management company and got bounced around to 3 different people before finally reaching someone who could help. Her name was Linda, and she sounded tired. "Mr. Kellerman, I am going to be honest with you," she said. "Mrs. Montgomery has filed more complaints than our entire rest of the association combined. If you want my advice, just submit the plan she is asking for. Make it look official. They will probably approve it and leave you alone." So that is what I did. I spent an entire weekend writing up a detailed property management plan. I included pruning schedules, pest management protocols, harvest timelines, and waste disposal methods. I added photos of the orchard in full bloom. I made it look like something you would submit to the Department of Agriculture. The application fee was $250, which seemed excessive, but I paid it. The board meeting was on a Thursday evening in November. It was held in the community center, a bland building with fluorescent lights and folding chairs. Besides Patricia, the board consisted of 4 other people. Richard Albright, the vice president, who was a retired accountant with wire-rimmed glasses. Susan Chen, the treasurer, a pleasant woman in her 40s who always looked vaguely apologetic. Marcus Thompson, the secretary, a muscular guy in his 30s who worked in tech and mostly stared at his phone. And Deborah Whitfield, a member-at-large who wore too much perfume and seemed to agree with everything Patricia said. I presented my plan. I showed photos. I explained that orchard management was a normal part of property maintenance for a property with an orchard. I pointed out that everything I was doing was designed to maintain property values by keeping the trees healthy and attractive. Patricia listened with her arms crossed. When I finished, she did not even pause. "The board appreciates your thoroughness, Mr. Kellerman, but we have serious concerns about the industrial nature of this equipment you are using. Specifically, this cider press. It is not residential equipment. It belongs in a commercial facility. It is a historic farm implement that came with the property. It has been here for decades. That may be, but the previous owner did not use it for commercial purposes. We need to ensure that all equipment on residential properties meets appropriate standards for a residential neighborhood." Richard cleared his throat. "Patricia, is the cider press really the issue here? It is in his barn. No one can even see it." "The issue is precedent, Richard. If we allow one homeowner to operate commercial agricultural equipment, where do we draw the line? Next, we will have people raising livestock or running farm stands from their front yards." Susan spoke up hesitantly. "Henry said he is not selling the cider anymore. Is that correct?" "That is correct," I said. "I am just maintaining my orchard and using the press for personal use." Patricia shook her head. "But you could sell it again at any time. We need to be proactive, not reactive. I move that we approve the property management plan with the condition that the cider press be removed from the property or rendered inoperable within 30 days. I felt my face flush. You want me to destroy a historic piece of equipment because you think I might possibly sell cider again. I want to protect the character and property values of this neighborhood. The motion is on the table. Marcus looked up from his phone. Do we really need to do this? Seems kind of extreme. Deborah jumped in immediately. I think Patricia makes an excellent point about precedent. We need to be consistent in our enforcement. They voted. Patricia and Deborah voted yes. Susan and Marcus voted no. Richard hesitated for a long moment, looking uncomfortable, then voted yes. The motion passed 3-2. I left that meeting furious. When I got home, I spent an hour on the phone with my buddy Craig, who is a lawyer in Portland. He specialized in real estate law, and I figured he might have some insight. HOAs can be tricky, Craig said. They do have a lot of power under Oregon law, but it is not unlimited. The question is whether their restriction is reasonable and applies equally to everyone. Do other people in your neighborhood have sheds with equipment, workshops, that kind of thing? Yes, definitely. My neighbor 2 doors down has a full woodworking shop in his garage. I can hear his table saw on weekends. Then you might have a case that they are applying rules inconsistently. But honestly, Henry, fighting an HOA is expensive and time-consuming. Is this really the hill you want to die on? It is the principle of the thing, Craig. This press has been on this property for 90 years. It is part of the property's history. I get it. Look, let me do some research and I will get back to you. In the meantime, do not destroy the press and do not let them on your property without permission. 2 days later, I got another letter from the HOA. This one informed me that they would be conducting a compliance inspection of my property to ensure that the cider press had been properly decommissioned. The inspection was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I called Craig immediately. Can they do that? Just come onto my property. Check your HOA agreement. Most of them include provisions allowing inspections for compliance purposes, but they usually need reasonable notice and you usually have the right to be present. I dug out my HOA documents and found the relevant section. They did have the right to inspect, and they had given the required 7 days notice. Technically, everything was by the book. Tuesday came. I took the day off work to be there. Patricia showed up with Richard, and a man I did not recognize, who she introduced as an agricultural equipment specialist. He was in his 20s, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo I did not recognize, and he looked extremely uncomfortable. We are here to verify the status of the cider press, Patricia announced. It is in the barn, exactly where it has been for 90 years, I said. We walked out to the barn, which was 100 feet behind my house. It was a well-maintained structure with good bones, though it definitely showed its age. The cider press sat in its usual spot near the back, a beautiful monster of cast iron and wood. It stood about 5 feet tall, with a large wheel for operating the press mechanism and a wooden basket for holding the apple pulp. The specialist walked around it, taking photos with his phone. Patricia stood with her clipboard, making notes. This is definitely industrial equipment, she said. This needs to be removed. It is farm equipment from 1932, I said, trying to keep my voice level. It is a historic artifact. It is like demanding someone remove an antique tractor or an old plow. Those items would also need to be reviewed for appropriateness. The specialist spoke up nervously. Actually, this is a pretty standard farm press for the era. You can see similar models in agricultural museums. It is not really industrial so much as it is agricultural. Patricia turned to him sharply. Is it residential equipment? Well, no, but residential is not really a category that existed when this was made. Farms were people's residences, so residential and agricultural were the same thing. Thank you for your assessment. Patricia made another note on her clipboard, clearly dismissing his actual opinion. After they left, I called Craig again and described what had happened. Okay, here is what I found, Craig said. Oregon law does give HOAs enforcement power, but they have to act reasonably and in good faith. If you can show they are targeting you specifically or applying rules inconsistently, you have a defense. I think you should push back on this. Send them a formal letter disputing their order. Do not let them just steamroll you. So I wrote a letter. I cited the fact that other homeowners had workshops and equipment. I pointed out that the cider press was a historic artifact that added value to the property. I requested a formal hearing before the full board with the opportunity to present evidence and witness testimony. I sent it certified mail. The response came back within a week. The board agreed to a hearing scheduled for December 15th. In the meantime, they were voluntarily suspending the compliance deadline. I spent the next 3 weeks preparing. I gathered historical documents about the property. I found old photos showing the orchard and the barn going back to the 1940s. I contacted a historian at the Oregon Historical Society who agreed to write a letter about the significance of preserving agricultural heritage. I even got statements from 3 of my neighbors saying they had no problem with my orchard or my cider press. The December hearing was more formal than the previous meeting. There were about 15 homeowners in attendance, which was unusual. Word had apparently gotten around about the dispute, and people were curious. I presented my case methodically. I showed the historical documents. I read the letter from the historian. I introduced my neighbors, who spoke briefly about how they appreciated the orchard and thought it enhanced the neighborhood's character. Then, Patricia presented the HOA's position. This is not about history or character, she said. This is about ensuring that Meadowbrook Springs remains a residential community, not an agricultural one. The covenants were written to protect property values by maintaining consistent standards. Mr. Kellerman purchased property with full knowledge of these covenants. He does not get to rewrite them because he finds them inconvenient. Richard spoke up. But Patricia, the orchard existed before the HOA was even formed. The covenants were written in 1995. This orchard has been here since the 1940s. Does not that grandfather it in? The orchard is grandfathered. We are not requiring him to remove the trees. We are addressing the commercial equipment. Equipment that has also been here for decades, I interjected. Equipment that was not being used commercially until you arrived. We went around and around for over an hour. Finally, they called for a vote. The motion was to uphold the original order requiring removal or decommissioning of the cider press. This time, Susan and Marcus voted no. Richard voted no as well, having apparently found his spine. Patricia and Deborah voted yes. The motion failed. I felt a wave of relief. It was over. But I should have known better. 3 days after the hearing, I went out to the barn to do some work. The door had a shiny new padlock on it. My key did not fit. There was a notice zip tied to the door handle. This structure has been secured pending compliance review. Contact the HOA office for access. I called the HOA office immediately and got transferred to Patricia. Why is there a lock on my barn? I demanded. The board determined that we needed to secure the non-compliant equipment while we reviewed our legal options. The motion from the hearing failed, but that does not resolve the underlying compliance issues. You cannot just lock up my property, Patricia. That is not legal. The barn is being treated as a non-compliant structure under Section 18 of the Covenants. We have the authority to secure non-compliant structures to prevent continued violations. The barn itself is not non-compliant. The cider press is inside the barn, and the motion to require its removal failed. We are consulting with our attorney. You will be notified of our decision once we have reviewed all options. I hung up and immediately called Craig. They did what? Craig sounded incredulous when I explained. Henry, that is not just aggressive, that might actually be illegal. They cannot just take control of your property without a court order. File a police report for vandalism and tampering with your property. Then we are going to send them a letter that will make their lawyer very nervous. I drove to the Meadowbrook Springs Police Department and filed a report. The officer who took my statement, a young guy named Officer Daniels, looked increasingly concerned as I explained the situation. So they put a lock on your barn without your permission, he asked. Correct. And they are refusing to remove it. They say they have the authority under the HOA covenants. Officer Daniels frowned. That seems like a civil matter mostly, but tampering with someone's property is a crime. Tell you what, let me make a call. He came back 15 minutes later with a sergeant, a woman in her 40s named Sergeant Ramirez. She listened to my story, looked over the HOA letter and shook her head. This is a mess, she said bluntly. Technically, putting a lock on your structure without permission could be criminal mischief, but HOAs do have certain rights. The problem is when those rights conflict with your property rights. Here is what I can do. I can go with you to the property and document the lock. If they have actually damaged your original lock or broken in, that is definitely criminal. If they just added a second lock, it is more of a gray area. We drove back to my property together. Sergeant Ramirez examined the door carefully. My original lock was still there, but someone had installed a heavy-duty hasp and padlock above it. They modified your door, she said. That is property damage, even if minor. I am going to document this and file a report. You need to send a formal demand to the HOA to remove the lock within 24 hours. If they refuse, you can file for a restraining order or injunction. In the meantime, technically, you could cut the lock yourself since it is your property, but I would advise getting a lawyer involved first. Craig sent a blistering letter to the HOA that same day. It cited Oregon property law, trespass statutes, and criminal mischief laws. It demanded removal of the lock within 24 hours and threatened legal action including damages and attorney's fees. The HOA's response came from their attorney, a firm out of Portland. The letter was condescending and bureaucratic. It claimed that the HOA had acted within its authority, that the barn contained equipment in violation of the covenants, and that securing the structure was a reasonable enforcement action. It suggested that I remove the cider press, and the lock would be removed. They are playing hardball, Craig said when I showed him the letter. Okay, time to file suit. This is going to cost some money, Henry, but I think we have a strong case. We filed a complaint in Clackamas County Circuit Court seeking an injunction to force the HOA to remove the lock and damages for trespass and interference with property rights. We also filed a motion for a temporary restraining order to get immediate relief. The hearing on the TRO was set for January 8th. In the meantime, my barn remained locked, and I could not access any of the tools, equipment, or supplies stored inside. But here is where things get interesting. While I was fighting the HOA, winter was doing what winter does in Oregon. It was raining. A lot. And my orchard, which I normally would have been preparing for winter, was not getting the care it needed because all my orchard supplies were locked in the barn. I had pruning equipment in there. I had dormant oil spray for preventing pest problems. I had fertilizer and soil amendments. I had the tools I used for inspecting the trees for disease and damage. All of it was inaccessible. I tried to buy duplicates of some items, but it was expensive, and I was already paying Craig's legal fees. I did what I could with basic tools, but it was not enough. January came, and with it, ice storms. Branches broke under the weight of ice. I could not properly treat them because my wound sealant was in the barn. In February, I noticed signs of disease on several trees. Fire blight probably, spreading from damaged tissue. I needed to prune out the infected wood and treat it, but my proper pruning saws and treatment supplies were locked away. The TRO hearing happened. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Helen Portman, listened to both sides. The HOA's attorney argued that this was purely an internal HOA matter, and the courts should not interfere. Craig argued that the HOA had overstepped its authority and was causing ongoing harm. Judge Portman asked the HOA's attorney directly, "Counselor, does your client have any authority under Oregon law to physically modify a homeowner's property without permission and without a court order?" The attorney hesitated. "Your Honor, the covenants grant broad enforcement powers." "That is not what I asked. Show me the specific provision that allows them to install locks on a homeowner's barn." He could not. Because it did not exist, Judge Portman granted the TRO. The HOA had to remove the lock within 48 hours. I should have been relieved, but by then, it was mid-January, and my orchard had gone over 2 months without proper care during a critical time. When I finally got back into my barn, I immediately grabbed my equipment and went to work, but the damage was already significant. 6 of my 28 trees had serious fire blight infections. 4 more had major structural damage from the ice storms that I had not been able to address in time. I spent every weekend in February and March trying to save what I could. I pruned aggressively, cutting away diseased wood. I treated the wounds. I consulted with an arborist who delivered the bad news. 3 of the trees were probably going to die. The others might recover, but it would take years and their productivity would be severely reduced in the meantime. The legal case continued. We were now into discovery, with both sides exchanging documents and taking depositions. Craig deposed Patricia, and according to him, she was completely unapologetic. She genuinely believes she was doing the right thing, Craig told me after the deposition. She thinks she was protecting the neighborhood from commercial encroachment. She showed no understanding that she might have overstepped. In April, 3 of my trees died completely. I had to cut them down. The arborist said 5 more were badly weakened and might not survive another stressful winter. My orchard, which had been thriving and productive, was now a mess. Dead trees, diseased trees, and drastically reduced fruit production. The spring bloom was sparse and sad. I documented everything. I took photos. I kept receipts for all the emergency treatments and replacement attempts. My damages were adding up fast. The HOA tried to settle in May. They offered to pay $5,000 and drop all compliance actions if I would dismiss the lawsuit. They are scared, Craig said. They know they screwed up, but $5,000 does not come close to covering your actual damages, never mind the principle of the thing. I rejected the settlement. In June, we got more bad news. 2 more trees died. The arborist said the stress from the fire blight and the delayed treatment had weakened them to the point where they could not recover. My orchard was now down to 23 trees, and 10 of those were in poor condition. The trial was set for September. As summer progressed, it became clear just how badly my orchard production had been affected. In previous years, I had harvested thousands of pounds of apples. This year, I would be lucky to get a few £100 from the healthiest trees. The damaged trees produced almost nothing. But here is where things took an unexpected turn. In August, I got a call from a man named Douglas Pritchard. He identified himself as a homeowner in Meadowbrook Springs and said he wanted to talk to me about the HOA situation. We met at a coffee shop. Douglas was in his 60s, retired, with silver hair and an air of quiet competence. "I have been following your case," he said. "Patricia Montgomery has been a problem for years. She has driven out 3 board members who disagreed with her. She uses the HOA as her personal fiefdom. Your situation is the worst I have seen, but it is not the first time she has overreached. Why have not people voted her out? Apathy, mostly. Most homeowners do not pay attention to HOA politics. They show up to the annual meeting, vote for whoever is already there, and go home. Patricia knows how to work the system. She controls the proxy votes, she stacks the nominations committee, and she makes it very difficult for challengers." "So what can be done?" Douglas smiled. "I have been organizing, quietly. After what happened to you, a lot of people are paying attention now. We have enough concerned homeowners to force a special election, but we need your help. Your case has become symbolic. If you win in court, it will give us momentum." We talked for over an hour. Douglas had done his homework. He had documented dozens of cases where Patricia had overstepped, bullied homeowners, and wasted HOA funds on petty enforcement actions. He had a whole group of homeowners ready to run for the board and reform the association. The trial started on September 23rd. Craig had prepared meticulously. We had expert witnesses, including the arborist who explained in detail how the delayed access to my equipment had caused the cascade of problems in my orchard. We had the historian who testified about the cultural and historical value of the cider press. We had documentation of every expense, every dead tree, every lost opportunity. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that the damage to my orchard was due to natural causes and weather, not the lock on my barn. Craig demolished that argument by having me testify about exactly what I would have done if I had access to my equipment, and having the arborist confirm that those actions would have prevented or minimized the damage. Patricia testified for a full day. She was poised and professional, but under cross-examination, her absolute certainty that she had been right started to look more like stubborn refusal to admit error. "Miss Montgomery, are you aware that 3 trees have died on Mr. Kellerman's property since you locked his barn?" Craig asked. "I am aware that he claims that," Patricia said. "You dispute the testimony of the certified arborist who examined the trees and documented their condition. I am not an expert in trees, but I do know that trees die for many reasons. Did you consider the possibility that locking up his orchard management equipment during a critical maintenance period might harm his trees?" "I considered that his non-compliant equipment was more important to address than hypothetical future tree problems." But the problems were not hypothetical, were they? They actually happened. In hindsight, there were some unfortunate consequences, but that does not mean the HOA's actions were wrong. Judge Portman took the case under advisement and said she would issue a written ruling within 30 days. While we waited, Douglas and his group collected signatures for a special election. They needed 20% of homeowners to petition for it. They got 35%. The special election was scheduled for November. All 5 board positions would be up for a vote. The judge's ruling came down on October 15th. It was 23 pages long, and it was scathing. Judge Portman found that the HOA had exceeded its authority, committed trespass, and caused direct harm to my property. She awarded me $87,000 in damages, including the value of the dead and damaged trees, lost production, emergency treatments, and consequential losses. She also awarded me attorney's fees, which added another $34,000 to the judgment. Most significantly, she wrote, while homeowners associations serve important functions in managing common areas and maintaining community standards, they are not granted unlimited power to interfere with homeowners' reasonable use of their own property. The HOA's actions in this case were not merely overzealous, they were reckless and caused foreseeable harm. No reasonable board could have believed that physically locking a homeowner's barn during winter months would not risk damage to his agricultural property. The judgment was against the HOA as an entity, which meant it would be paid from the HOA's general funds. The reaction in the neighborhood was immediate. The HOA had about $240,000 in reserves. A judgment of $121,000 would take half of that. The remaining funds were supposed to cover emergency repairs, insurance deductibles, and long-term maintenance of common areas. Suddenly, every homeowner was paying attention. The special election campaign became heated. Patricia and her allies tried to paint Douglas's group as troublemakers who wanted to eliminate all rules. Douglas's group focused on fiscal responsibility and reasonable governance. I stayed mostly out of the campaign, but I did attend a candidates forum in late October. Patricia was there, defending her record. I have always acted in what I believe to be the best interests of this community, she said. Sometimes, enforcing rules is unpopular, but someone has to have the courage to maintain standards. A homeowner in the audience, a woman named Michelle, raised her hand. Patricia, how is bankrupting the HOA with a massive lawsuit maintaining standards? That is our money you lost. That is a gross mischaracterization. The HOA has not been bankrupted. We have sufficient reserves. We had sufficient reserves. Now we have half of what we had because you decided to pick a fight over a piece of farm equipment that had been on that property for 90 years. The forum got tense. Other homeowners chimed in with their own complaints about Patricia's leadership. It became clear that the lawsuit had been the final straw for a lot of people who had been quietly frustrated for years. Election day was November 12th. The turnout was unusually high for an HOA election, nearly 60%. When the votes were counted, Patricia and all four of her allies lost. Douglas and his entire slate won. The new board was sworn in on December 1st. Their first action was to vote to formally apologize to me and to commit to paying the judgment promptly. Their second action was to repeal the agricultural equipment restrictions that Patricia had used to target my cider press. But the financial damage was real. The new board conducted an audit and discovered that the situation was even worse than they thought. Patricia's legal strategy had been expensive. The HOA had spent over $40,000 on attorney's fees fighting my case, money that was also gone. Combined with the judgment, the HOA had burned through almost 2/3 of its reserves. To make matters worse, the roof on the community center needed replacement. The previous board had been putting it off, but it could not be delayed anymore. The estimate was $90,000. The new board faced an ugly reality. They were going to have to impose a special assessment on all homeowners to rebuild the reserves and cover the necessary repairs. In January, every homeowner in Meadowbrook Springs got a letter informing them of a special assessment of $800 per household, due by March 1st. The letter explained the situation clearly. The previous board's mismanagement and the lawsuit judgment had depleted reserves to dangerous levels. The reaction was predictable. Homeowners were furious, and they knew exactly who to blame. Patricia tried to keep a low profile, but it was impossible in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. I heard through the grapevine that people were confronting her at the grocery store, at church, anywhere they saw her. Some confrontations were polite but pointed. Others were apparently quite heated. In February, Patricia's house went on the market. She was moving. According to Douglas, who heard it from someone who knew her realtor, she and her husband were relocating to Arizona to be closer to their daughter. Running away, Douglas said when he told me. But at least she is gone. The special assessment was paid, grudgingly, by most homeowners. A few struggled with it, and the new board worked with them to set up payment plans. Slowly, the HOA's finances stabilized. As for me, I used part of the judgment money to restore my orchard. I replaced the 7 trees that had died and invested in extensive treatment and care for the damaged ones. I hired a professional orchard management company to help me nurse the weakened trees back to health. I also did something else. I contacted a local agricultural museum and arranged to have the cider press documented and placed on a historic registry. It was not going anywhere, but now it had official recognition as a historic agricultural artifact. The orchard began to recover. By the second spring after the lawsuit, the new trees were establishing well, and the damaged trees were showing signs of improvement. I was not back to full production yet, but I was getting there. I started pressing cider again, too. Small batches, just for myself and friends. And in a small act of defiance, I invited the entire neighborhood to an open house in October, where I gave away fresh pressed cider and showed people the historic press that had caused so much trouble. Over 100 people showed up. They toured the orchard, admired the press, and drank cider. Douglas gave a short speech about community and reasonable governance. It felt like healing, but the story does not end there, because in March of the following year, I got a call from a detective with the Oregon Department of Justice. "Mr. Kellerman, my name is Detective Lisa Martinez. I am with the Financial Crimes Unit. I am investigating allegations of embezzlement and fraud involving the Meadowbrook Springs Homeowners Association. Your name came up in our investigation, and I was hoping you might have time to talk." I met with Detective Martinez the following week. She was a sharp woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. She explained that someone had filed a complaint alleging that Patricia Montgomery had misused HOA funds during her time as president. The new board conducted an audit and found some irregularities, Detective Martinez explained. Nothing jumped out as obviously criminal at first, but they kept digging. It looks like over the course of several years, Patricia approved payments to various vendors for services that were either never performed or were significantly overcharged. We are talking about roughly $40,000 that cannot be accounted for. You think she was embezzling? I think someone was. Whether it was her or whether she was just negligent in oversight, that is what I am trying to determine. I understand you had significant conflicts with Miss Montgomery. Can you tell me about your interactions with her? I spent 2 hours describing everything that had happened. Detective Martinez took detailed notes and asked perceptive questions. As I was leaving, she said, "Off the record, Mr. Kellerman, I have seen a lot of HOA cases. Usually, it is just people on power trips being petty. But sometimes, the petness is a smokescreen. When someone is that aggressive about control, it is worth asking what they are trying to control." The investigation continued through the spring and summer. I heard updates through Douglas, who was now serving as HOA president. The more the auditors and investigators dug, the worse it looked. Patricia had apparently created a network of fictitious vendors and shell companies. She would approve payments for landscaping work, maintenance services, and consulting fees. The invoices looked legitimate, but the companies were either non-existent or were entities she controlled. The money would flow out of the HOA accounts and ultimately end up in accounts she could access. It was not sophisticated fraud, but it did not need to be. As president, she controlled most of the financial oversight. The other board members had trusted her. The HOA's bookkeeping was loose enough that discrepancies were not obvious unless you looked carefully. By August, Detective Martinez had built a strong case. Patricia was charged with 14 counts of theft in the first degree, 4 counts of forgery, and 6 counts of fraudulent schemes and artifices. The total amount she had allegedly stolen was just over $63,000. Her arrest made the local news. Former HOA president charged with embezzlement ran the headline in the Oregonian. The story detailed the charges and mentioned the lawsuit judgment against the HOA. Some reporters drew a connection, suggesting that Patricia's aggressive enforcement actions might have been attempts to distract from financial irregularities. I do not know if that was true. Maybe she was just a control freak who also happened to be stealing. Maybe the stealing made her more paranoid and aggressive. Either way, her reign of terror over Meadowbrook Springs was definitively over. The criminal case moved slowly, as these things do. Patricia hired a lawyer and fought the charges. The case was scheduled for trial in the following spring. But in January, she took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 8 counts of theft in the first degree in exchange for dropping the other charges. The sentencing hearing was in February. I attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom. Patricia looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. Her husband sat behind her, looking shell-shocked. Her attorney made a statement about how she took responsibility for her actions and was deeply sorry. Patricia herself gave a brief statement, her voice shaking. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. "I started taking money because I felt I was spending so much time on HOA work and not being compensated. I told myself I deserved it. Then it became easier to keep doing it. I am ashamed and I accept responsibility." The judge, a stern man named Judge Richard Canton, was not sympathetic. "Miss Montgomery, you were in a position of trust. Homeowners in your community relied on you to manage their collective resources honestly and competently. Instead, you stole from them. And when you were faced with a homeowner who challenged your authority, you abused your position to retaliate against him, causing him substantial financial harm. Your conduct shows a pattern of dishonesty and abuse of power that warrants a serious sentence." He sentenced her to 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. She was also ordered to pay full restitution of $63,000 to the HOA. The courtroom was quiet. Patricia's husband buried his face in his hands. Patricia stood stiffly, absorbing the sentence. As people filed out, Douglas caught up with me in the hallway. "Well, that is that," he said. 3 years. Honestly, I thought she might get less." The judge seemed pretty angry about the abuse of trust angle, I said. "Good. She earned it." We walked out into the gray February afternoon. I felt oddly hollow. I had won the lawsuit. The orchard was recovering. Patricia was going to prison. Justice had been served in every meaningful sense, but it all felt so unnecessary. "You know what the crazy thing is?" I said to Douglas. "If she had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. I was not bothering anyone. I was just making cider from my own apples." Douglas nodded. "Some people cannot help themselves. They need to control everything, and when they can't, they lash out." The HOA eventually recovered financially. Between Patricia's restitution payments, better financial management, and some good luck with lower-than-expected maintenance costs, the reserves were rebuilt. The special assessment was painful, but it was a one-time thing. The new board instituted serious reforms. They hired a professional management company to handle the books. They implemented transparent budgeting and regular financial reporting to homeowners. They overhauled the enforcement procedures to include clear standards and an appeal process. They turned Meadowbrook Springs into a model of reasonable HOA governance. As for my orchard, it came back stronger than ever. By the third year after the lawsuit, I had replaced all the dead trees and the damaged ones had mostly recovered. My production was higher than it had ever been. I pressed cider every fall, using Walter's grandfather's press. I never sold it commercially again, just gave it away to friends and neighbors. But the press ran beautifully, and every time I used it, I thought about how close it had come to being destroyed over one person's need for control. I also thought about the unexpected chain of events. A locked barn led to a neglected orchard, which led to a massive lawsuit, which led to a special election, which led to a financial audit, which led to a criminal investigation, which led to Patricia Montgomery spending 3 years in prison. All because she could not tolerate the idea of someone pressing apples in their own barn. One Saturday in October, 3 years after the whole mess started, I was in the barn operating the press. The sun was streaming through the high windows, illuminating the amber cider flowing from the spout. The air smelled like apples and autumn. Douglas stopped by with his wife to pick up some cider. He stood watching the press work, the big wheel turning smoothly, the machinery doing exactly what it had been designed to do 90 years ago. "You know, Henry, you could have avoided all of this if you had just gotten rid of this thing when Patricia first asked," Douglas said. I looked at him to see if he was serious. He was grinning. "Sure," I said. "And I could have avoided a lot of trouble in middle school if I had just given my lunch money to the bully. Some things are worth standing up for. Even if it costs you 7 dead apple trees and a year of legal hell, even then." Douglas nodded slowly. "I am glad you did. If you had not fought back, Patricia would still be running the HOA and stealing money. A lot of people benefited from your stubbornness." "I prefer to think of it as principled resistance," I said. "Sure, we will go with that." We filled containers with fresh cider and carried them out to his car. The orchard stretched out behind us, the trees heavy with fruit in the slanting afternoon light. It looked exactly like it should, like it had probably looked for decades. A piece of agricultural heritage stubbornly persisting in a residential neighborhood. And in the barn, the 1932 cider press sat ready for the next batch, a monument to the idea that sometimes the old ways are worth preserving, even when petty tyrants try to stamp them out. Patricia Montgomery served her time, and as far as I know, moved to Arizona after her release. I never saw her again. The other board members who had enabled her quietly faded from community involvement, embarrassed by their association with her corruption. Meadowbrook Springs became a better community because of the crisis, which is perhaps the best outcome anyone could have hoped for. The homeowners learned to pay attention. The board learned to govern responsibly, and everyone learned that abuse of power, even in something as mundane as a homeowners association, has consequences. As for me, I kept making cider, tending my orchard, and enjoying the property I had bought because of those 28 apple trees. The 7 I had lost were replaced with young, vigorous stock that would produce for decades to come. The remaining original trees had been through hell but survived, tougher for the experience. There is probably a metaphor in there somewhere about resilience and recovery, about weathering storms and emerging stronger. But mostly, I just think about how a piece of farm equipment from 1932 outlasted a petty tyrant from 2023, and how sometimes the most important battles are the ones we never expected to fight. Every fall, when the apples ripen and I fire up that old press, I remember Walter's words from when he sold me the property. "You promise me you will use it, son." I kept that promise. And in keeping it, I accidentally helped clean up an entire HOA board, sent a corrupt president to prison, and proved that even in the 21st century, there is still room for people who want to maintain connections to the land and to history. The cider press still sits in my barn, now properly documented as a historic agricultural artifact. It still works perfectly, turning apples into golden cider just as reliably as it did when Walter's grandfather first assembled it 90 years ago. It has outlasted the Depression, World War II, the turn of the millennium, and Patricia Montgomery's attempt to destroy it. I figure it will still be pressing apples long after I am gone, which means Walter's grandfather's craftsmanship lives on, and that is a kind of immortality. Some might say I made too big a deal out of a piece of old equipment, that I should have just compromised, removed the press, and avoided the whole nightmare. But I do not think principles work that way. Either you stand up for what matters or you do not. And if you let people steamroll you over small things, they will keep steamrolling you over bigger things. Patricia Montgomery tried to steamroll me. She locked up my equipment, damaged my orchard, and cost herself her freedom in the process. The rotted fruit from my neglected orchard became symbolic of her rotted leadership, and it ultimately bankrupted not just the HOA's finances, but her entire board's credibility and her own future. Justice is not always poetic, but sometimes it gets pretty close.